Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little more about user services, but I'm going to be starting adding the contextual side of API development. So I'm going to add an API to our application. This means that it'll have a client side, just like we've done before in the previous web applications. And now we're going to add in some of .NET 8's new features for the account management, things like registration, login, email confirmation, two-factor authentication, and of course your account management. With these, it's good to understand that the .NET account features are basic. They do what they need to do. They work within the identity framework. But one of the best things, of course, about the .NET Identity Services like this is it's very extensible. So I'm going to try to show you how to extend on some of those, but most importantly, get you started with some of the basics and pushing in those API endpoints that are available in the .NET 8 Identity Services group. Now, when we look at what we have at the moment, in my last video, we created a generic controller. So now what we're going to be doing here is we're going to add in a few new features into our application. Namely, as I mentioned, the API endpoints. And it's really simple to do that. That's the best part about this, is all I have to do is add API endpoints, and it's already there. So if you're already working within a .NET 8 application, you've kind of got everything that you need out of the box. Now with that, we also, because we're adding API endpoints, one of the things that I want to add now is Swashbuckle. And that way we can use the Open API documentation model. And to do that, I'm just going to go to the NuGet package manager here and do a search for Swashbuckle. Now you can see I've done a search for it before. It must be the ASP.NET Core version. You see a lot of other things here that at the moment we don't need all of that. So we will just look at the ASP.NET Core Swashbuckle and do an install. Hit accept. Excellent. We're installed, and that will allow us to add in the Swagger endpoint Explorer. And by doing this, what that again allows for us to have is this awesome UI that we can explore our API that is built within the application. So we just simply add in services, got to spell right, and all we have to do here is add endpoint explorer and build the services, builder services dot add swagger gen. Excellent. All right, now there's a few other things that we need to do to prepare our application to be able to use some of the new authentication features that we have in .NET 8. One of the things that I want to maintain in this application is, on one side, we want to maintain the generic cookie authentication that is already built in. Whenever I log in, it manages that cookie. I can browse throughout my application without any trouble and still work within my user confines. Now, the thing that we want to do here is we want to add some authentication methods here. And the reason again is, at the moment we already have cookie authentication, but we want to also add in bearer token authentication. Now the way this works here, bearer token you don't want to get confused with this. You don't want to confuse this with a JWT. JWT are very different than bearer token, although they are both bearer tokens. This is a Microsoft bearer token. So don't get confused with them. You won't be able to go to JWT.io and browse through what's in that token. It doesn't quite work the same way. But we do have to specify that we have what's the name of this bearer token, and we're just going to simply specify bearer scheme. All right. Now, one thing I did notice is that if I don't specify it, it seems to give me a problem. I haven't worked too deeply to find out why it gives the problem, but it does, and putting in the schema seems to solve the problem. Now, one other thing that I discovered over the past couple of weeks while researching this part is that adding a policy to my API that allows for specific schemes to work around that API seems to be important. You can't just add in the authentic or the authorized attribute and expect it to work, unless of course you're taking away cookies. So I want to maintain cookies because I still want to be able to browse to the API for any of the get features. I should be able to get that information just with the cookie. Nothing special there, but essentially that's what I'm trying to achieve here. So one of the things that I've found is that building a policy for those APIs is something important. If you have no requirement for maintaining cookies, this is a redundant step. But let's add an authentication builder. Now, authentication builder allows us to build policies. Now, if you're familiar with building policies, policies are actually a very useful thing when you are working within a larger scale application. Even smaller applications can use policies because it might be things like different types of administrative accounts, so role policy, specific actions that that people can perform or not perform as well. But there's a lot of things that you can do with policies, and I would definitely suggest that you try to learn about how to apply policies to your application. It's something that you're going to find you're using a lot. All right, now for this API, we are always going to be requiring authenticated users, mostly because when we action on any of the API endpoints, they're all going to be using the user context that we set up. So it's obviously going to have an authenticated user, or the action will fail. So we're going to add in authentication schemes, and those schemes come in the form of an array, and you'll see that they all come from this identity constants. Now, once again, I have found there's certain things that you do need and some things that you don't need. You can get away with just application scheme and bearer scheme for this demonstration. But if you require things like two-factor authentication and external scheme would be something like logging in with your Google account or your Microsoft account or your LinkedIn account. Anything like that would be our external scheme. So what I'm focused on right now is just that we can use our application scheme and our bearer scheme. All right, so now that we've got our policy in place, let's move down into the application builder section. We added Swagger earlier, so I'm going to make sure that Swagger is available. So we're going to add Swagger. Whoops. Use Swagger. And we have to add in Swagger UI as well. That's the actual endpoint that we can navigate to see what our API Explorer shows us. And we also added authentication methods, so we do have to add this, and order is important. We want to authenticate first, then authorize. And the next thing that we have to do, and this is the final thing that makes all of this work, is map those endpoints to a group. Now, I can just do this. I can simply do map identity API. It asks me for my user type, which is application user. We've set that up in our apps before. Now I could just do this, but what it will do is it will set up a set of endpoints that are in the root of my domain. And I don't really want that. It's not really specific enough to do that. I generally like my APIs to be mapped to the API domain or path. And so what I'm going to do here is it will be under API and account. All right. So let's go ahead and try to run this. We'll see if we get any problems. We should be okay, but who knows? Okay, so we're up here and let's test that login still works. If login still works, we should be okay to keep moving around the application. Let's test that we can access our companies, and we can. Should be able to still create new companies. Just do that, and of course edit companies. Good. All right, so everything seems to be working the way we're expecting. Now, one thing that we want to do is test Swagger. Now, this is fairly simple. You just type Swagger at the end of your URL, and we go into Swagger. What we see here is that we have our user services, and we have endpoints that are register, login, refresh token, confirming an email, resend confirmation email, forgot password, reset password, two-factor authentication, managing info. This would be the get, so it gets our info. And then, of course, we can post changes to our info. So this is the basics of what an endpoint manager for account actually does. We don't need a whole lot more to make this point work, but we have to put it into action now. So in order to actually get the information that I need working, I have to try and test it with our Postman. And I like using Postman, so if you have another endpoint tester that you like to use, feel free to go ahead. Okay, so here we are in Postman, and I have a couple services that are already predefined. If I look at my login here, so the login request requires an email and password. When I send this request, it's a post, so if I send it, what I'm going to get back is an access token. It's going to be type bearer, a access token here. It expires, this is how long this token actually lasts, and I get a refresh token as well. Now these are really helpful things because what I will be doing is using this access token throughout the application. So I will use this one as my access token that I consistently send to my application for access to information. And then if my token expires, I can use this refresh token on the refresh endpoint and generate a new token just the same. We probably won't have to use that endpoint today because I won't likely uh, uh, end up having to expire my token, but there is some note to So in the login request, the path is very simple. We've set up as API account login. That would correspond with this right here. So if I wanted to try it out just the same here, I could do that quite easily. I generally prefer to use Postman because I can use these variables and of course protect my confidential information. Not that I have anything confidential in these test users. Now, in the email and password, you're going to put your email address that you used to sign up into your own application. And finally, your password is essential to make this work as the qualifier there as well. So let's send that request to our application. What we get here, we get a token type of bearer back. We have an access token. We have an expires in, so this is how long this token will last. And of course, we have a refresh token. That refresh token can be used against the refresh endpoint right here, and you can see that it requires a refresh token. So really all we have to do is send that refresh token. It will then parse through that token and send us back an access token. As it shows here, it's pretty much the same function that is used with login, except that instead of giving it a email and password or user credentials, we simply give it a refresh token, and that means the application recognizes that you are already an authenticated user, and it can work with you in that respect. So let's go ahead and move along to our next step here. Now the next step that we're going to do is add in an API controller. Now, if we look at the way our controllers are set up right now, fairly simple, standard MVC models. One of the things that I do like to do when I create controllers for APIs is I like to add a new namespace for them, and that will be under the controllers as API. So if I add in an API controller here, we're just going to do this very basic here. I'm not going to add a lot of extra stuff into it, but I will have read-write actions. And we do add. And I'm going to start off by calling this company's controller. Now, company's controller is it essentially acts the same as our other company's controller that we had before. We built this using the user controller that we built in the last video. Now, it's going to this company's controller is going to be very similar. I'm actually going to start off with just the basics of how do I get something from an API controller, number one. But then I'm going to raise it up to be an authorized controller, and then add in the ability to access our companies. So let's go ahead and give us a shot and see what we actually get when we navigate to companies controller without authentication. All right, so our app is up and running. Let's go to API/companies. Let's make sure we spell that right. Companies, there we have it. All right, so it brings back two values, value 1, value 2. If I go back over to our code, this is what we were expecting because we asked for value 1 and value 2. Now, in this case here, when we look at the get method with an ID, I could really put anything in the ID, so we'll try this out and see what happens here. This will only just bring back one thing here. So if I just do companies one, it brings back value, and that is because it is expecting to bring back just simply value. Now, in here, in the rest of the API, I have post ability, I have put. So post, if you're not familiar, is the equivalent to create. Put is the equivalent to update, and of course delete handles delete. You'll notice that there are a lot fewer things that can be done, or not can be done, but fewer endpoints or actions within the API model than there is in the company's controller with views. And that's a good thing. So when we start to develop this out, you'll see that we can really work with the basics of data management in an API sense, rather than thinking about what the view requires. However, we do need to think about something called cyclic redundancy, and that is going to happen in the context of Entity Framework. Entity Framework has a fantastic method of working with models, and let's just go into our company for just a moment here. Now, if you recall, application user has a collection of companies, which each company is a company, and company has a connection to a user. So when I ask for a company, it also gives me user. That gives me a set of companies, which also gives me users. And that causes a cyclic redundancy as I'm trying to convert over my company to a JSON output. All right. So when we deal with that, what we're going to do first here is I'm going to add in some of the functionality that we require to make our company's controller work. Okay, so let's get started with that. So the things that we need to make this company's controller work, we're going to ask for a reference to our user context, because that's what we spent a lot of time building in past applications. So we can look for user context, and that's going to come directly from the dependency injection. Next, I'm going to set up a reference as well to our companies repository, and that will be our repository. Okay, now in order to make these things happen, we have to create a constructor and gather up the user context from dependency injection. Okay. And that equals user context. All right, so with this, now we have access to our user context. The next thing that we are also going to do is add in a reference, because we're going to refer to that repository again. If you remember how we set it up a few videos ago, I set it up so that we could access our repository just from as a property, right? So it'll be very similar. So this is going to be property that gets. In fact, let's just do our short form here. Company's repository, and it will be called repository. This will only be a getter. So in this case, we want to do if repository equals null, in other words, it hasn't been used yet, we are going to get the repository from the user context. So user context.companies. And of course, you may recall as well that we built that nice little repository feature. You could go directly to companies, or you could go this way, repository, companies repository, and it'll work the same way. The next step, the final step in this, is to return repository. All right. So with that, we now have an access to our repository. And something else that I've set up before is a set private method. And that's because I just want to sometimes just be able to call a very small function call rather than using repository.getAll. I'm just going to make this a little more simplified here. Company. All right, and it is called set. This simply returns await repository. I spell things right. Repository dot get all. Okay, there we go. Now, we have these nice little features set up here. One of the things that we have to now do, let's just stop this here for a moment. We've done quite a bit without stopping. And the next step that I'm going to do is return the set in our getter. All right. Now, in order to do this, now I mentioned as well before that I can still use the get methods within the confines of cookies, but for doing posts and put and delete, I actually have to use postman. So in this case, what I'll do is I'm going to await set. And it's complaining here because it's implying that we are going to return an IEnumerable string. Well, we're not doing that. What we are doing is returning an IEnumerable of company, but set is a queryable. So we can simply do this, and that should give us the opportunity to return what we want. And because this is an async as well, we have to wrap that in task. All right, and there we have it. So with that, I can now run my application and use the set, which is related to simply repository.getAll. Now this is where I'm going to demonstrate that cyclic redundancy that we talked about. And if you've never heard of the term DTO, that's a data transfer object. If you've never heard of the term DTO, I'm going to talk about that today. We're going to go a little deeper into how to deal with modified objects as they're being sent back to the client. So let's do our API companies. Now this is going to fail because we don't have a user at the moment. It's giving us nothing, but if we log in and go back over to our API/companies, we will get the error that I talked about. All right, so this is our cyclic redundancy. It tells us that it's going through user companies, user companies, user companies to a depth of 32, and then says, hey, wait a minute, there's a problem here. All right, so how do we make this work? Well, the way we make this work is to select out the features that we actually need in our object. So in this case, what we're going to do is I'm going to return a new object that has the ID of the company and the name of the company. Now I could be very specific here. I could also make sure that I have it specifically labeled. In these cases, I don't necessarily have to do that. So why is it complaining here? Well, when we're returning back an anonymous object here, all right, it's giving back saying, well, I'm going to give you an ID and a name. It's not a company, but I'm still going to give you back an object. So Entity Framework or .NET have some nice ways of dealing with this type of problem. And one thing that you can do is do an action result, and even just an I action result will work. And because what we're returning here is a list before, we don't actually have to return it as a list. Now we can just do an OK result and return it just the way it is here. We'll just make a quick correction here because it's saying that select doesn't exist, and that is because my brackets are not surrounding the proper information here. So what we have now is a select statement that brings us back the ID and name of company. Let's run this again and see what happens. And we'll navigate to our API companies. And there we have it. So now we have all of the information that we expect. We see the same data coming back here as we see in our companies page. If we go to companies, it's exactly the same information. All right. So this is good. We are getting back the information we expect. So let's move on to the get with an ID. Now, get with an ID is going to be slightly different, but very similar in the way it executes. So from here, and you'll notice I'm going to be using generic terms once again. The reason being is we will convert this to a generic repository once more. And this is going to be finding the ID. Now find ID is obviously, it's not an int because the repository for company's repository is expecting a string as the primary key. That's the ID property. So we simply change that. And we are also, once again, we're going to return a task. Whoops. I action result, making this look like this. Now, once more, if I return entity the way it is with no changes, this means it's going to include the top level properties, ID, name, user ID, and the user navigation property. Now we don't want it to return the navigation property, and we're also not interested in returning the user ID as well. Because ultimately, if we're returning this through the API, we already know that the user ID is for the person that is requesting it because it is coming directly from the claims principal. So we're going to do this. We're going to create an anonymous object. Can I use my keyboard properly? And this is going to be ID entity dot name once more, and there we have it. So if I go ahead and run it one more time, okay, we'll access our API companies first. One thing that we need here in order for the get to work, we need a valid ID. So we just have to append it just like this and ask for the data just the way we expect it. Now with that, because we are now getting back our anonymous object here, we're obviously not actually returning a company anymore. You could return it as a company and just simply fill in the ID and name, but because there are several properties that will be null, it doesn't make a lot of sense to send null properties back to the client. So we're doing what we need to do in this case. Now, the next thing that we have is our post method. Now, our post method is fairly straightforward as well. If I look back to the way we post in our base user controller, I'll go back to create. There's a few things that we can do. We need to handle any issues with the model as it's being added. We need to handle model state. But the interesting thing about .NET Core and model state for APIs is that model state can be managed in the pipeline prior to reaching your action. And I'm not always excited about that because there are times when I really want to ensure that my model is validated by me. So there's a few things that I do that are slightly different than other developers, and I find that my way is good. If you have any critiques around it, by all means, let me know. I'd love to hear it and see if there's a different way to manage some of this. However, I'm digressing. The key responsibilities of the create or post method is to add and save to the database. All right. So let's go ahead and do that. Where are we here? There we go. All right. So we're not bringing in a string, but we are bringing in a company. Now, a company not necessarily is when you're posting, you're not necessarily giving an entire company. Really all you're doing in this case is saying, here's the important information that allows me to generate a company. Okay, and a company inevitably is in this case anyhow is just name. Um, and but you can imagine if I just said just supply string name, probably not our best way of handling it. So one of the things that I do is I often will say, give me a JSON document. Now, a JSON document, because it won't be validated, it will provide, what we're going to do is provide validation at another point. Okay. I like to do it within the method. Some people like to do it outside of the method because they're saying, hey, give me a company and do my method, my model state validation before I'm going to imply that the people know who are using this understand how to build a company. But as you've seen before, some model state errors appear because they are part of the model, such as the ID, the user ID, the user. These aren't things that are necessarily required for building the model up from a post, but model state does check them. So if we look at what we need from this post method, we are going to wrap this in a try catch. Now, what's different about your API controllers as opposed to a view controller is in this case you can throw errors either with some semblance of what an expected error pattern, if you will, or you can just throw the error as is. In this case, I'm going to throw it as is. You could obviously wrap it into some sort of model, a standard error model that would respond so that if your users are receiving an error, they can expect that if they see an error property, for example, in the model, then they can interpret what to do with that error. Okay, so let's go ahead and work with our model here. Now, in this case, we don't have to do a whole lot, but we will do a little bit of validation. So let's just assume that we are going to pass in a company of some sort. So what we're going to do in order to make this work, what we're going to do is we're going to use a little reflection action. We're going to create an instance of an object of type T. Oops, in this case, company. Now, I could have, in this context, I could have just gone company, new company. No problem, nothing would be wrong with that. This, however, allows us to think a little bit ahead with some of the code that we're going to do in a generic API controller. So in this case, we have a company. Company in this way needs a name, and that's all it needs in order to make this work. So how do we actually get the name from the JSON? Well, what we have is a very simple function, but it's kind of lengthy, and you're going to see that you're going to want a better way of accessing the data from a JSON document at some point. However, we'll do this. So what we have is the root element, and then we have an enumerate object, and we're going to ask for the first or default where string dot equals, and we're going to ask for the name property. Okay, now this will seem just a little strange. The reason I'm doing this way is because, and this was going to be x dot name. It's these two names are not the same. The name is because it's a key value, so it's a name and a value. And then we have a string comparison. We're going to ignore case. All right. Now from this, we're going to ask for value. Okay, and dot get string. Now that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff to put out just to get one property from the JSON document. However, this does give us more versatility in what's coming in. What I'm doing here, and the reason I had to do it like this, is because generally, if someone is posting using JSON, they're usually going to use a lowercase version of name, but not necessarily. So what I've done is I've taken away the reason to think about case, and it just says give me any name that looks like this, with the name that looks like name, and match it up to here. Okay, so if I go ahead and run our application now, to make this work inside the API, I do have to use Postman, so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Oh, actually I have to save that. So let's fix that problem. And we want to return a, oops. Create it at action. And this is created at post. And the object that's going to be returned is entity. Okay, and we need to fix up our return value, so that is also going to be a task of I action result. All right, I think we're pretty good here. Let's go ahead and run it. Okay, so our application is running. We have no problems getting started. We're going to go over to our Postman, and we are going to look into the body of our call. This is a post, and we're doing a request that's going to API companies. This post is going to go to that post method that we did. I have a couple variables here that I use for testing, and essentially, if you want to know what how those variables come about, you can just simply set them like this. This is just a little script that I use. And that, of course, allows me to identify things as I'm testing. I can tell the timestamp that I'm doing. So in this case, I have a JSON object that's going to send out to my post method. Let's find out what happens when I push send. So this is a great little error that's come up here. And this is our check to see if we have a user. All right. Now, this is an important one for us to recognize, because number one, we know that our user context works, but number two, we have a couple other things that we have to do with our controller before we actually get it to work. So let's stop this, and we'll go back to our controller, and we have to add the authorize attribute. Now, once the authorize attribute is there, it will then allow for that authentication to occur and give us our claims principal. All right, we're up and running one more time. Let's see what happens with Postman. We'll send this. And what we're getting now is a different type of error. We are getting the 200 status, and it's directing us back to the login. Now, believe me, this is by design. This is exactly what I'm expecting to see. So what we want to do, and if you recall, we set up a little policy for the authorize method so that in order for our authorized to authenticate on the schemas that we expect, we can just do the authorize using the API policy. Let's run this again. All right, we're up and running again. Let's try Postman, and we'll do our send. Now this should work this time. Let's see what happens. Fantastic. So now we have an object returned. It's a brand new company object. And if I go back over to my web application, I should now see in my companies page, I can now see that I have companies with the new testing and a timestamp. So we know that our post works, and that's great. You'll notice as well that because we returned everything, all it did here was simply give us back exactly the information we would expect, with the exception of filling in the user object. If the user object was filled, then we would have some trouble. So in order to ensure that we don't have trouble on that, what we can do is the same thing that we did up here in our get. As we can do something like that. Now I don't need to go ahead and test that, but I'm hoping that you get the general idea in making this work. Now, going back to this JSON document query, what I would recommend is that you build something of an extension for the JSON property onto JSON property, so that you can just say, give me this property, and it doesn't have all the extra stuff that you're looking at there. The other thing that I've often done is converted it to a dynamic. That way I can just say, the value dot name would give me the same thing. I've done that before. Using a dynamic can make it a little bit slower, but it gives you a lot of flexibility and freedom there once again. Now, do remember that when we create this into a generic, we will make a few function changes so that we can make it a little bit more extensible, but you kind of get the idea here. All right, so let's move into our put method. Now put is the same as update, so we are going to look at our edit feature here. We have a method to confirm whether we have a valid ID, so why not move that over there? Okay, we want to make sure that our information is correct there, and this is also going to be a JSON document. And in this case, what I'm going to do is steal some code here, and I'm going to call this var model ID. Okay, and it is going to be getting the ID property. Now what this implies here is that it's going to ask for the ID property. If ID doesn't exist, well, it's going to error out anyhow, but the goal ultimately is that if it does exist, we can qualify whether it is working or not. This is also going to be returning an async. It's going to be a task, or not a task, but a task I action result. So that way, if we have a problem here, we can make a change. Actually, I'm going to have it return bad request in this way. I could have done the same in the other controller. Really doesn't matter. Now, what's next in our set of things to do? We have to go out and find the entity that is currently in the database that relates to ID. So let's go ahead and do that. And of course, I'm going to wrap all this into a try catch. All right. So with that, we know that we have, and I'll just convert that to string. So with that, we know that we have a valid ID. We're going to ask now for the entity off the database. So with that, we have to make a few changes. We are going to do the same thing that we did up here in the post. So now we're getting the entity from the database. We're asking for name. In other words, the only thing that I can change in company is name. If I have more features, without a doubt, I can do that. Okay. The next thing is saving the changes. So I can just simply copy that and save those changes. And the next thing that I want to do is return OK. Now, if you recall, whenever returning this, I'm going to extract just the information that I want the user to receive, and that should be everything I need in the put case. All right, so let's go ahead and run that. All right, so we're up and running. Let's go over to Postman. Now, one of the things that I did with the last post, and something that I often do, is I'll ask for using a post test. I simply will go out and say, all right, give me the last ID, and I put it into collections, and that just allows me to run a set of tests on my API. So with that, I'm going to send that data. We're going to create a new post, and we'll know that our post works in a second. Okay, so we have a new object to work with. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the name on the object, and all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take that last post ID and change the name to a new timestamp. Great. Okay, so now we have a put method that is working. If I did want to make this change here and say testing, testing, for example, I could also do it just the same, and I know that it's working because that's what's coming back. All right. So we know that we have our get and get by ID working, so let's do a get here. All right, we have all of our gets working. Let's do a test on get by ID. Excellent. So we have all of our features working except the delete method now. All right, so let's do our delete method. Now delete is fairly simple as well. If you have examples where you need to do deletes on collections, for example, this is something that where you'll have to intercept this through that pipeline and delete those objects as necessary. But at the same time, all you're doing here is sending a delete, and it's quite simple. So let's look at our delete confirmed from our other controller. We have a few things that we have to do. Testing the ID, checking whether we have an entity on the database, deleting it, and then saving changes. Okay, so I'm going to take some of this out here, actually pretty much all of it, and we'll go over here. Now, there's a couple qualifications that we need to work with, and so here we have if ID equals null. Well, a string can be null, it can be empty, so we actually want to have a little more qualification around that. Null or empty. And if string is null or empty, then we want to return. And of course this is also asynchronous, and it is an I-action in this case. Now I'm using I-action quite literally here, or liberally. We'll make some changes as we go to that. And finally we're going to return OK if everything went OK. Let's put this into a try catch, so that if something does go wrong, we can catch some predictable errors. All right, so with this, we have an entity that's found. If we have a problem, then we return not found. And oh, by the way, I should probably do bad request, not found. And the same would kind of go for the other controller. So if you want to make your updates to that controller, feel free to go ahead. Now, it's going to do a delete, save changes, and return OK if everything worked. So let's give that a try. All right, we're up and running. Let's check into Postman. Okay, here is my delete method. It's a request that you can see it's all the same patterns that we used all along. The only difference is that it pushes in the ID at this point. That ID will end up being right here as expected. We'll go over, and now if you remember, I have my variable as last post, so we've used that before, so that we have a current value in it, and it just simply stores the ID from this post that we used. And send that request. Okay, we returned OK. Now you may have noticed that my time is very slow, and now this is a very slow laptop that I'm using, unfortunately. But to delete these will be actually very quick, especially if you're not using up a lot of memory on your laptop. So once more, I can go through, and I'm going to go through the whole gamut of tests here. So we'll go to post. We will make an update. Okay. We'll do a get to see if we have that that new data, and there it is right there. We're going to do a get by ID. Okay, we now have we know that we're getting back, and we're going to do a delete. And there we have it. So very quick, and as well, you can also see that as we're moving through those actions, the time is actually much less than it was before, and that's just through caching. So some of the great things that the API magic behind the scenes does for us. Okay, so this was an interesting adventure here. And one of the things that I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to build this into a generic API user controller. This will be important here because now once I do this, I can start implementing many APIs into my system without, or endpoints into my system without having to do a whole lot of extra work to get them up and running. And there's a huge upside and value to doing that. So I look forward to seeing you in my next videos. Remember to like and share. Your support really helps. So please click that notification bell as well. And, you know, I love you guys. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the support. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.